Hello YouTube, Sidekick here, and I'm here again in my trusty P-47 Jug, getting ready to take off on a little training mission, but this video is not actually going to be about this mission, or even really about this aircraft. Today I kind of want to talk about why Warbirds are, at least for me, so difficult to learn how to fly, at least to learn how to fly well, in modern flight sims like DCS and Microsoft Flight Simulator. Now, I already talked about this a little bit in a video where I reviewed the P-40B module in Microsoft Flight Simulator, and you really should check out that video, because if you like flying Warbirds, it's one you won't regret picking up. But in that video, I talked a little bit about why I think learning to fly Warbirds poses some real challenges compared to learning to fly modern jets in the sim. But since that video was a Microsoft Flight Simulator video, I'm not sure a lot of my DCS viewers got a chance to see it. Also, in that video, although I spent a bit of time talking about why it's an issue, we didn't really talk about what to do about it. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. Why Warbirds can be so frustrating and what you can do about it. To put this in perspective, my experience with Warbirds goes back a long way. I've been flying flight sim versions of World War II aircraft pretty much since there have been simulations of same. In particular, I spent a lot of time in the IL-2 franchise, including the current incarnation of Cliffs of Dover and Great Battles. Now, these days, I spend most of my time in DCS and Microsoft Flight Simulator, and there are so many other aircraft to fly in these sims that I hadn't, until relatively recently, spent much time in Warbirds. But starting a while back, I decided to give it a try. It started in DCS with the Mosquito, and then came the Jug, and in Microsoft Flight Simulator, I was really interested in the AT-6, which Americans call the Texan, but which everybody in the British Commonwealth calls the Harvard, and which is a kind of a true icon of Canadian aviation. And if you want to know why, you can check out my video on Canada's history as the aerodrome of democracy. But finally, a month or so ago, I got the P-40 in Flight Simulator. And about the same time as picking up the P-40, I was making some pretty in-depth videos on using the Jug in ground attack mode. And I'll tell you, I was finding it pretty tough. I really had a hard time flying the aircraft as well as I would like to. In the P-47, it was a real struggle to fly precisely enough to get consistent bombing results. In the P-40, it was just a constant struggle to get off the ground and get back down in one piece. Now, I've improved over the last few weeks. I would classify myself as barely competent to fly these aircraft, but I'm improving, and I am also learning what I need to learn to continue to get better, which is kind of half the struggle. But man, it's taken a long time to get here. Much longer than it ever has pretty much in any other sim aircraft. Now, I'm not a professional pilot, having accumulated about 50 hours of actual flight time about 40 years ago. But I am a pretty experienced sim pilot. My computer implies that I've actually spent more than 1,000 hours combined in Microsoft Flight Simulator and DCS by now, but I'm not sure that it isn't in league with my wife, and so it might be lying to me. I am also not completely unfamiliar with the process of learning new and sometimes complex physical skills. So it really did get me thinking, why is learning to fly Warbirds so hard compared to modern jets? And why is it gotten harder as the simulations have gotten better? And you know, I think there is actually some reasons for these things. And those reasons basically broke down into two categories. The first has to do with the nature of the simulation itself, and the second has to do with the real physical experience of flying the aircraft. Because even though it's still flying, a lot has changed in 80 years in the world of military aircraft. So let's take a look at the difference between a modern jet like the F-16 or the F-18 and a World War II Warbird like the P-47 or the P-40. Now, one of the things that's happened over the last 80 years is that cockpit and flight control systems have benefited from a huge amount of research into human factors engineering, which is the study, essentially, of how to make things easy or hard for humans to do. The various inputs in these cockpits, in modern cockpits, have been collected and combined into a display that synthesizes all of the sensor input into symbology and places it on a head-up display. And that has actually been engineered specifically to make it intuitive and easy to interpret. Now, this was an absolute necessity Because as the missions that modern aircraft need to perform and the sensor platforms that they use to perform them have become more and more complex, it really has become a priority to reduce the amount of effort that is needed to actually fly the aircraft. Simply put, modern aircraft reduce the amount of effort and attention required to fly the aircraft, so pilots will have the attention available to do all of the other things that make them effective. Similarly, the controllers in a modern jet are connected to the control surfaces through a digital interface. This is what is called fly-by-wire, which means that the pilot doesn't actually move the control surfaces with the stick and rudder. He actually sends commands to a computer that interprets his intent and then sends the commands to the control surfaces. Now, consider a 1940s Warbird. First of all, consider the fact that 1940s Warbirds were literally less than a decade removed from the first all-metal monoplane aircraft with retractable landing gear. Seriously. Further, consider that the engines installed in these aircraft were quite literally some of the most powerful piston engines ever developed, and that their performance had literally increased by a factor of 4 in a little over a decade. These aircraft were at the cutting edge of technology at the time, but the understanding of how to control them easily was a long way behind the power curve. They were still effectively using the same controls and instruments that had been around since just after the First World War. In these aircraft, the pilot was provided with all of the information that was needed to fly, but it was all provided in separate analog gauges, and each gauge was connected to a single sensor. It was up to the pilot to create the synthetic display in his head to understand what the interaction of the various sensors meant for the state of the airplane and what to do about it. Now, to be fair, things happened a lot more slowly, even in a high-performance piston engine fighter, than they do in a modern jet, so pilots had more time to evaluate and assess the inputs they were getting, but there was no digital assistance available to speed that assimilation or make it more intuitive. And an awful lot of input was not visual, as it is in a modern jet. Warbirds were flown much more by feel than modern jets are. It's a common saying that the Spitfire pilots did not so much sit in the Spitfire as they put it on and wore it, implying not only that the cockpit was pretty tight fit, but also that the sensation of flying was transmitted directly to the pilot's whole body. And this, in fact, was enhanced by the fact that in a Warbird, the controls are actually connected directly and physically to the control surfaces, usually by pulleys and wire. Now, sometimes there is some mechanical advantage added, but there's no assistance from hydraulics or anything like that. So when a pilot pulls back on the stick, he immediately gets feedback in the form of how hard it is to pull, and also in the form of subtle vibrations experienced by the control surface and transmitted right back up to his arm. When the aircraft is flying slowly, controls become mushy and easy to move as the control surfaces lose their effectiveness. But try to pull back on the stick in a steep dive, and it might actually become a physical challenge to move the stick at all. Approach a stall in a tight turn, and the buffeting of the wings will be transmitted directly to the hand of the pilot through the stick. Now, some of these cues are so effective that they've actually been duplicated artificially in modern fly-by-wire systems through things like stick shakers that activate near the stall. The point being, though, that flying a Warbird well depends on senses other than sight, and definitely to a greater extent than flying a modern jet does. And this effect is exacerbated by one other fact of human physiology, and that's the fact that human beings are much better at going in straight lines than they are at going around in circles. There are a bunch of reasons for this that aren't worth getting into here, but if you need proof, consider the fact that no one ever got dizzy moving in a straight line. You can go as fast as you like in a straight line, you can speed up and slow down all you want. You might make yourself a little nauseous, but you'll never be completely disoriented. But spinning around in a circle more than twice, and your world will rapidly stop making sense. It's a fact. Our brains are much better moving in straight lines than they are at rotating. And this is the other thing that divides modern jets from prop-driven Warbirds. In a jet, the engine is behind you, and the thrust is generated in a straight line, usually pretty much directly through your body. And it's very intuitive, that kind of motion. In a prop-driven aircraft, there is thrust backwards that pulls the aircraft, yes, but this is combined with a truly massive amount of torque, or rotational force, that makes the plane want to rotate as well as move forward. And this is a challenge for our brains. It's a particular problem for our eyes that are really not very good at sensing the difference between a sideways motion and a rotation about a point. Now our ears, our inner ears, are much better at sensing that difference, which is, by the way, why we get dizzy. Okay, so the point here is not to discuss which kind of aircraft is better or harder to fly or issues about real life. What we're talking about here is how the aircraft are simulated and how easy it is to fly them in a simulator. Well, let's take a look. For a modern jet, you have an airplane where the pilot relies on a visual display that is a synthetic depiction of two dimensions, and he controls the aircraft with digital input devices that are connected through a computer to the control surfaces. Most of the acceleration tends to be in a straight line, and there is relatively little coupling between the various axes of control. And you want to simulate that experience with a desktop computer using a 2D display and digital input devices connected to the computer. Well, that's a pretty good fit. It says nothing about the effort that's required to produce a high-fidelity simulation of the flying experience, but providing a simulator pilot with an input that is similar to what a real pilot would use is relatively straightforward. Now, with a Warbird, you have an airplane where the pilot uses his 3D vision in conjunction with other visual information available from instruments. He uses audio feedback for some very important cues, but he also relies heavily on physical feedback, both through the stick and rudder, and also through his sensation of the motion of the aircraft. And this is particularly true when the aircraft is rotating rather than flying in a straight line, because the pilot senses these motions more directly with his inner ear than with his eyes. Now, once again, your tools for simulating this experience are a desktop computer using a 2D display and digital input devices to connect to the computer, which is not such a good fit. So no matter what you do, you're just not going to be able to deliver an experience that is as easy for a simulator pilot to assimilate as the jet pilot experience is going to be. No matter what you do, there are going to be layers of abstraction in simulating Warbirds that are more, well, abstract than they are in a jet, and that's my point. In a weird way, as the quality of the actual simulation improves, the layers of abstraction actually become more important. When physical simulation was relatively low fidelity, the simulation and the abstraction were kind of mixed. The airplane didn't really behave like a real airplane, so its performance was part of the abstraction, and pilots' actions could be interpreted by the simulation, which meant that the simulation was less accurate, but it was a bit more manageable. The simulation was actually spending some time figuring out what you wanted to do, rather than just reacting to what you did. As the simulation fidelity has improved, more and more of this abstraction has been removed. But that means effectively that pilots are actually getting less assistance in flying the aircraft. More and more we're being exposed to the reality of flying an aircraft that responds to both touch and feel, except that we don't have any way to touch it or feel it. So why am I talking about all this? Is this just an excuse for why I frankly suck as a Warbird pilot? Well, yeah. To some extent it is. But it's also because this is the conversation I've had to have with myself about why I do suck, even after quite a bit of effort, and kind of to reduce the frustration that comes from that fact. I mean, flying Warbirds in DCS and Microsoft Flight Simulator is hard, because it's hard. I just need to get used to that. But it does leave open the question about what to do about it. So, to avoid just complaining and trying to be a little bit constructive, here are my 5 top tips for surviving Warbirds in Digital Combat Simulator and Microsoft Flight Simulator. Number 1. Just fly. For all the reasons I listed, flying Warbirds takes a lot of practice, and a lot of that practice has to just be in flying the aircraft. For all the reasons I listed above, it takes a lot longer to just become competent at flying a Warbird than it does a modern jet in the simulator. The good news is that, unlike a modern jet, there are far fewer systems to learn to use, so you should spend your time in sim just flying. Forget about dogfighting, or bombing, or doing circuits even. Just get up in the air and fly the plane. Keep it simple, but focus on flying it well, and flying it precisely. Learn all of the subtle cues that the aircraft is giving you, and make interpreting those cues second nature. 2. The engine is your baby. I don't really have time to go into all the details here, although I probably will in another video. But for a lot of good reasons, high-performance piston engines needed to be carefully managed and monitored to avoid pushing them beyond their limits. Actually, a big part of the reason for this is that in order to be capable of performing at very high altitudes, engines needed to have the capacity to be overdriven at low altitudes, and you need to avoid doing that. So the best thing to do is to read the aircraft manual, but failing that, there are just some basic rules of thumb. Don't fly at maximum power for more than a couple of minutes, and in general, try to reduce your manifold pressure to less than 40 inches or about 10 pounds of boost. Never exceed 3,000 RPM, even if the plane will let you, and try to keep the revs actually below about 2,800, and learn where your engine temperature gauges are, and keep an eye on them. Number 3. Keep your eye on the ball. Flying coordinated is both much more difficult and more important in a Warbird than it is in a modern jet. With modern fly-by-wire systems, you can do an awful lot of flying without ever putting your feet on the pedals, and the turn and slip indicator is an instrument you might not even be able to find in the cockpit. A Warbird, you need to constantly fly with your feet. You also need to constantly adjust rudder trim. Flying uncoordinated seriously affects the performance of your aircraft and the precision of your flying. You can't get to full speed or full rate of climb if the aircraft is not flying coordinated. But also, critically, the turn and slip indicator is a visible indication of an effect that, in a real plane, you'd feel, but in the simulator you can't. So pay attention to what that little ball, or arrow, is telling you. Number 4. Push the envelope. When you do go out and fly, make it a point to push the limits of the aircraft. Learn how it behaves at the edges of the envelope. Learn to understand how the sim is telling you that a stall is coming, both in level flight and in a tight turn. Learn how landing gear and flaps affect the way the aircraft flies, and how that effect changes as the airplane slows from approach speed to stall speed. Also, take it as an opportunity to learn some aerobatics. Check out some videos on techniques like the chandelle, wingover, split S, Immelman, and the loop. Learning to fly these procedures will help you learn to fly with precision, and it will also help you learn what the aircraft feels like in extreme maneuvers like those that you'll need when you actually start trying to fight the aircraft. Number 5. Think with your hands and your feet. Remember that a Warbird is a little bit like a helicopter. Whatever you do with your left hand is going to be felt in your feet. Every time you adjust the power, you adjust the torque that the engine delivers. Every change in torque needs to be matched by a change in rudder. Sometimes the effect is subtle, but sometimes it's very significant. It's not uncommon, as I am absolutely sure you have already discovered if you have ever tried to take off in a Warbird, to find yourself in a situation where you simply don't have enough rudder authority to counteract the change in torque caused by changing the throttle. Again, this would be much easier to recognize and correct if you could feel the rotational effects of torque and yaw, but you can't. So you have to learn to unconsciously react to the cues that the simulator actually does give you. Well, that's my list. Now, there are a lot of much more experienced Warbird pilots out there than I am, and if you are one of them, please feel free to add your own tips in the comments, or come to the Discord channel and start a conversation about anything you saw or heard today. In the meantime, if you're out there trying to learn a Warbird, good luck. And this is going to be Sidekick, signing off.